Death is the great equalizer, Plato. Picture this, a silent killer that cared nothing for wealth, status, or the borders drawn by kings. A force so devastating, it made sworn enemies reach across battlefields to grasp each other's hands. The Black Death, history's great paradox. While the 100 Years' War raged between England and France, something more terrifying than any army swept through Europe. A pestilence that would claim over 1/3 of the continent's population and force bitter enemies to reconsider what truly mattered. What force could be so powerful that it would make Muslims and Christians share medical knowledge? What invisible enemy could unite Venetians and Genoese after centuries of bloodshed? Have you ever wondered what it would take for sworn enemies to set aside centuries of hatred? What existential threat would be required for kingdoms to share their most guarded secrets, their medical knowledge, their trade routes, their survival strategies? The forgotten plague that united enemies reveals a dark truth about humanity. Sometimes we need catastrophe to remember our common humanity. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it found a Europe divided by war, religion, and feudal loyalties. Kings who had spent decades plotting each other's downfall suddenly faced a common enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't defeat through conventional warfare. The plague created unlikely alliances. Islamic medical knowledge from Avicenna and Al-Razi flowed into Christian Europe. Venice and Genoa, maritime rivals who had battled for centuries, established the first coordinated quarantine systems in human history. Our tribal instincts, the very psychology that drives us to war, temporarily yielded to survival instinct. But why did it take death on such a massive scale? The plague exploited a cognitive blind spot in human psychology, our difficulty in uniting against invisible threats. We evolved to fear the enemy we can see, the rival tribe, the foreign army, the different faith. But microscopic killers trigger no such instinctual response until bodies begin to pile in the streets. A Black Death created what philosophers call a boundary situation, a moment when normal social constructs collapse under existential threat. Suddenly, the French king and English monarch found themselves sharing medical knowledge rather than exchanging arrows. By 1377, the first coordinated international quarantine systems emerged, a revolutionary concept requiring enemy states to trust each other's information and enforcement. The very concept was unthinkable before. This forced collaboration gave birth to modern public health. The plague hospitals of Venice became models adopted by former enemies. Sanitation measures developed in Muslim Spain were implemented in Christian Europe. For the first time, health transcended borders, religion, and ancient hatreds. But this unity came at a terrible cost. Must we always require catastrophe to see beyond our differences? Is our capacity for collaboration always hidden behind the veil of crisis? The plague revealed something profound about human society. Our divisions are largely constructs of our own making. When faced with extinction, the borders we draw, the gods we worship, and the kings we serve suddenly seem trivial compared to our shared vulnerability. The plague didn't care if you were English or French, Christian or Muslim. This forgotten chapter of history planted seeds that would eventually grow into our modern concepts of international cooperation. Consider how radical this shift was. Kings who had spent generations teaching their people to hate and fear their neighbors were suddenly encouraging cooperation. Religions that had declared each other heretical were sharing medical texts. Trade rivals were establishing common protocols to prevent contagion. The plague's paradox deepens when we recognize its long-term consequences. This catastrophe that killed millions ultimately improved living standards for survivors, accelerated the end of feudalism, and forced innovations in medicine that would save countless future lives through international cooperation. But could we have achieved these advances without the catastrophe? Must progress always be purchased with suffering? Now imagine a radical shift in perspective. What if we didn't wait for catastrophe to unite us? The Black Death teaches us that humans possess an extraordinary capacity for cooperation that typically lies dormant until awakened by shared suffering. But history's most revolutionary figures, from Buddha to Mandela, showed us another path. Even in the plague-ravaged Middle Ages, there were examples of cooperation without catastrophe. The multicultural scholars of Toledo translated knowledge across enemy lines. The Silk Road connected hostile empires through mutual benefit. Diplomatic marriages created peace where war had raged for generations. The plague forced another revolutionary concept, that public health required input from all levels of society. Suddenly, a peasant's observations about disease spread were as valuable as a noble's proclamations. What if we could harness this capacity for cooperation without requiring the stimulus of disaster? What if we could build bridges before the flood rather than after? The societies that recovered most effectively from the Black Death were those that maintained their cooperative structures after the immediate threat passed. Venice's Public Health Council became permanent. International quarantine protocols outlived the plague itself. Medical knowledge continued to flow across former boundaries. Yet many regions reverted to their old conflicts once the plague subsided. The 100 Years' War resumed. Religious persecution returned. The tribal psychology that the plague had temporarily suspended reasserted itself, at great cost to the societies that surrendered to it. Those who maintained cooperation enjoyed Renaissance-like flourishing. Knowledge preserved by Arab scholars during Europe's darkest hours returned to catalyze new thinking. Trade networks, rebuilt along more equitable lines, created prosperity. The plague forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Our greatest enemy has never been each other, but rather our failure to recognize our common vulnerability and interdependence until disaster makes it undeniable. When the plague arrived, I was forced to consult texts I had been taught were heretical, wrote one French physician in 1349. To my shock, I found wisdom in Arabic writings that saved many Christian lives. I wonder now what other truths I have rejected through ignorance. Here lies the plague's most profound lesson. Our divisions, whether medieval kingdoms or modern nations, are ultimately artificial constructs that collapse under existential threat. The boundaries we fight over vanish when death comes equally to all doors. The differences we magnify shrink when we face extinction. The enemies we create become allies when survival demands cooperation. The plague's paradox reveals our greatest human potential, our capacity to transcend artificial boundaries when necessity demands it. But it also exposes our greatest folly, waiting for catastrophe to activate this capacity rather than embracing it proactively. What would our world look like if we maintained crisis-level cooperation during times of peace? What innovations might emerge if knowledge flowed freely across all boundaries? The forgotten plague that united enemies offers us a radical reframing of human potential. Perhaps our greatest achievement isn't our capacity for individual genius, but our ability to transcend boundaries when survival demands it. Perhaps our greatest untapped resource isn't some undiscovered energy source, but the collaborative power we only access in our darkest hours. The plague teaches us that unity isn't just a moral ideal, it's a survival strategy. The kingdoms that coordinated their responses survived better than those that remained isolated. the cities that shared medical knowledge saved more lives. The most profound revelation is this: what we call human nature contains both our tribal instinct for division and our transcendent capacity for unity. The plague didn't create our ability to cooperate across boundaries. It merely revealed what was always possible when we recognized our common humanity. Perhaps the plague's darkest gift was to show us through suffering what we are capable of when we set aside our differences. The question it leaves us with echoes across centuries. Must we always wait for catastrophe to become our best selves? Or can we choose unity before death forces our hand?